The most dangerous moment in the life of Cassius Clay didn't happen in a boxing ring. It didn't happen in Kinshasa against George Foreman, and it didn't happen in Manila against Joe Frazier. The moment that almost erased the greatest athlete of the 20th century happened in total silence, inside a smoke-filled room on the 8th floor of the Hotel Teresa on a cold Monday night in March 1963. There were no cameras. There were no reporters. There was just a 21-year-old kid in a white bathrobe, trembling with a rage he couldn't release, and a 34-year-old mobster named Anthony Salerno, better known to the streets of New York as Tony Pictures. Salerno was a man who specialized in the kind of photography you didn't put in a family album. He sat on the edge of Clay's unmade bed, lighting a cigarette with the casual arrogance of a man who knows he holds all the aces. He took a drag, exhaled a gray cloud toward the Olympic gold medalist, and delivered a message from the Genovese crime family that was as simple as it was devastating. You have 48 hours, boy. Lose the fight or lose everything. Boy. That word. It hung in the air like poison gas. For 300 years, that word had been the whip used to cut black men down to size, a verbal shackle designed to remind them that no matter how big, how strong, or how rich they became, they were still property. But hearing it here, in the heart of Harlem, directed at the fastest heavyweight contender in the world, it felt like a violation of the laws of physics. Cassius Clay was the Louisville Lip. He was the beautiful, brash, unstoppable force of nature who predicted the round and called the shots. But in that hotel room, stripped of his entourage and his bravado, he was suddenly just a 21-year-old black kid with a secret that could ruin him, because Tony Pictures wasn't bluffing. The mob didn't need to break Clay's legs to destroy him. They had something far more lethal. They had a reel-to-reel tape recording. A recording that had traveled from a wiretap planted by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, passed through the hands of a corrupt agent with gambling debts, and landed in the safe of Vincent the Chin Gigante. On that tape was the sound of America's golden boy committing the ultimate sin of 1963, praying to Allah. It was the sound of Cassius Clay talking to Malcolm X, admitting his conversion to the Nation of Islam, and plotting to announce it to the world. In the racially segregated, paranoid America of the early 60s, that tape was a nuclear bomb. If it leaked, the sponsors would vanish, the boxing commissions would strip his license, the white establishment that tolerated his antics would crush him before he ever got a shot at Sonny Liston. Salerno stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an accountant, and that made it worse. Tuesday night against Doug Jones, Salerno said, walking to the door. You don't just lose. You make it look convincing. You go the distance, and then you lay down. Do that, and you get your title shot. Win, and by Friday morning, you'll be fighting in church basements for spare change. The door clicked shut. The lock turned, and Cassius Clay was left alone in the silence of room 847, staring at the walls of the Hotel Teresa. This is the story of the 48 hours that followed that click. It is the story of a choice between selling your soul to survive or risking your life to be free. But more than that, it is the story of what happened when the irresistible force of the Italian mafia collided with the immovable object of Harlem's underworld. Because when Cassius Clay picked up the phone that night, he didn't call the police. He didn't call the NAACP. He called the one man in New York City who looked at the Italian mob and didn't blink. A man who had just walked out of Alcatraz after 11 years in a steel cage. A man named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy Johnson was about to remind the world that in his Harlem, to understand why a phone call from a 21-year-old boxer could shift the tectonic plates of the New York underworld, you first have to understand the man on the other end of the line. And to understand Bumpy Johnson in the spring of 1963, you have to go back to The Rock, Alcatraz, the end of the line, the concrete tomb sitting in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay. For 11 years, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in a 5x9 cell, listening to the foghorns and the seagulls, cut off from the city he had once ruled like a pharaoh. 11 years is a lifetime in the streets. In the underworld, power's perishable. It rots if you don't use it. When Bumpy walked through those iron gates for the final time in January 1963, the Federal Bureau of Prisons marked him as rehabilitated. The NYPD marked him as obsolete, and the Italian Mafia, they marked him as harmless. They were all wrong. Bumpy returned to a Harlem that had changed. The Harlem of the Renaissance, of Duke Ellington and tuxedoed nights at the Cotton Club, was fading. In its place, a harder, colder reality was setting in, and the architects of this new misery weren't hard to find. While Bumpy was counting days in isolation, the Genovese crime family had moved uptown. They had crossed the invisible line at 110th Street that Bumpy had spent his life defending. Leading this invasion was Vincent the Chin Gigante, a rising captain with dead eyes and a reputation for violence that made other mobsters check their locks twice. Gigante didn't care about the community. He didn't care about the people. He saw Harlem as a resource to be stripped. He had flooded the avenues with heroin, turning the vibrant blocks Bumpy used to protect into open-air desperation. He had bought the politicians Bumpy used to own. He had terrified the shopkeepers Bumpy used to tax. By March of 1963, on the surface, Bumpy Johnson was a king without an heir, castle. A 58-year-old relic walking through the ruins of his former glory, watching Italian soldiers collect envelopes on 125th Street. But Bumpy Johnson had a secret that J. Edgar Hoover didn't know, and Vincent Gigante was too arrogant to see. You see, power isn't just muscle. It isn't just guns. Power is information. And for 11 years, while the world thought Bumpy was rotting, he was actually building. Every month, letters had gone out from Alcatraz, coded messages tucked inside family correspondence. Whispers passed through visiting wives and cousins. Bumpy couldn't run the streets from a cell, but he could maintain the relationships. When he stepped back onto the pavement of Harlem, his visible empire was gone. But his invisible army was waiting. It was an army the Italians didn't even know existed, because they didn't look at the people in it. They didn't look at the cleaning lady scrubbing the floor of the Italian social club on Pleasant Avenue. They didn't look at the porter carrying their luggage at Penn Station. They didn't notice the barber shaving their necks or the doorman tipping his hat. These were the invisible people of New York, the workers, the servers, the quiet observers. And they were loyal to only one man. They were the eyes and ears of a king in exile. They heard the whispers. They saw who came and went. They knew where the skeletons were buried, and more importantly, they knew where the safes were located. So when Cassius Clay called Bumpy Johnson that night, he wasn't just calling an ex-con. He was activating a dormant network that covered the entire city like a nerve system. The Italians had the guns. They had the money. They had the political connections. But Bumpy Johnson had the streets. And in 48 hours, the streets were going to go to war, 11:47 p.m., March 11th, 1963. The office above Small's Paradise Jazz Club didn't look like a war room. It smelled of expensive cigars, old leather, and history. The walls were a shrine to a Harlem that Bumpy Johnson had built. Black and white photographs of him shaking hands with councilmen, standing shoulder to shoulder with jazz legends, looking like a man who could buy your building or burn it down with equal ease. Cassius Clay sat in a high-backed leather chair, trying very hard not to look like a terrified 21-year-old. He was used to the bright lights of the ring, where he could dance and shout and predict the future. But in this room, the lights were dim and the future was uncertain. Across from him sat the most dangerous man in Harlem. At first glance, Bumpy Johnson was disappointing. He was 58 years old, wearing a simple gray suit, his hair thinning, his face lined with the map of a hard life. He looked like a grandfather. He looked like a deacon at Sunday service. But then you looked at the eyes. They were the eyes of a shark in deep water, flat, unblinking, watching Clay with a terrifying stillness that made the young boxer feel like he was being X-rayed. In the corner, a mountain of a man named Illinois Gordon stood with his arms crossed, Bumpy's right hand, his shadow, and his executioner. Clay had spent 20 minutes pouring out the story. The tape, Tony pictures, the ultimatum, the word boy. When he finished, the silence in the room was heavy enough to crush a man. Finally, Bumpy leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying more weight than any scream. "They called you boy," he said. Clay nodded and replied, "Yes, sir." Bumpy asked, "And you didn't take their deal? You didn't just agree to lose? It would be easy, one night, one fall, then you get everything you want." Clay hesitated. It was the question that had been eating him alive since the hotel room. Why not just submit? Why not just play the game? But then he looked at Bumpy and he saw something familiar. He saw the same defiance that burned in his own chest. "Mr. Johnson," Clay said, his voice rising with passion, "they aren't asking me to lose a fight. They are asking me to become their property. If I throw this fight, they own me, forever. My daddy painted signs for white folks his whole life. Colored entrance in the rear. Whites only. He spent his life painting words that told him he was nothing. I'm supposed to be different. I'm supposed to be free. I will lose my career before I lose myself. I'll die before I kneel." The room went silent again, but something in the air had shifted. The ice in Bumpy Johnson's eyes began to crack. He wasn't looking at a boxer anymore. He was looking at a mirror. He was looking at himself, 30 years ago, fresh from South Carolina, standing on a Harlem street corner with nothing but a switchblade and a refusal to be broken. Bumpy stood up, walked around the desk, and sat on the edge, inches from the future champion. "I was about your age when I learned the price of pride," he told him. 11 years in Alcatraz, 11. Years watching my city fall apart from 3,000 miles away because I wouldn't bend. He paused, letting the reality sink in. "If I help you, young brother, there is no turning back. The Italians will know it was me. This isn't a boxing match. There are no referees. There are no bells. This could start a war where people die. Do you understand that?" Clay stood up and extended a trembling hand. "I understand. Tomorrow night, I fight Doug Jones. I'll handle the man in front of me. Can you handle the men in the shadows?" Bumpy looked at the hand. Then he shook it. The grip was iron. "You win your fight," Bumpy said. "Give them hell. And while you're in that ring, I'll take care of the tape. By the time the final bell rings, it won't exist." Clay blinked and asked, "How can you be sure?" Bumpy smiled. It was a cold, wolfish smile that had been making men nervous since the Hoover administration. "Because," he said, "I'm going to burn it myself." March 12th, 1963. The sun rose over Harlem, but Bumpy Johnson hadn't slept. The moment Cassius Clay left Small's Paradise, the office transformed from a meeting place into a command center. Bumpy stood over a map of New York City spread across his mahogany desk, his finger tracing the arteries of the Italian strongholds, knowing he had 20 hours to find a single magnetic tape hidden somewhere in a city of 8 million people. To the NYPD, this was impossible, and to the FBI, it was a fantasy. But Bumpy Johnson didn't use police tactics. He used the streets. At 8 a.m., the order went out, not by telephone, which could be tapped, but by mouth. It moved through the barbershops on 125th Street where men talked while getting a shave, through the beauty parlors where women whispered under hairdryers, and through the back doors of kitchens and the service elevators of luxury hotels. Bumpy's network was awake. By noon, the whispers had turned into echoes, and by 2 p.m. the echoes had turned into coordinates. A numbers runner named Little Pete, operating deep in Italian territory near the Pleasant Avenue Fish Market, noticed a nondescript brownstone, number 2847, where the windows were always covered and men in silk suits went in with briefcases, only to come out empty-handed. Then came the confirmation from a waitress named Teresa at an Italian bistro, a woman the mobsters treated like furniture, who overheard a captain bragging about the Clay insurance policy sitting in the second-floor safe. The target was locked, but knowing where the tape was turned out to be the easy part. Getting it out was suicide. Bumpy assembled his ghosts, specialists who weren't the flashy gangsters of the movies. Marcus Webb, a Korean war veteran with a scar running down his face who handled security. Whispers Monroe, a man who could walk through a room of 50 people without being remembered. And the battering ram, Illinois Gordon. They gathered around the map as dusk fell, the air in the room thick with smoke and adrenaline. Bumpy laid out the situation. The tape was in a safe on the second floor of 2847 Pleasant Avenue, guarded by 2 men outside and 4 inside. "We go in tomorrow night at 8:30, he told them. That was the 4th round of the Clay fight, the exact moment every Italian in New York with a pulse would be glued to a television set, cheering for Doug Jones to knock their boy out. That was when they would hit them, when they were distracted and arrogant. But then Marcus Webb pointed to the safe on the diagram and asked the question everyone was thinking. What about the combination? They could get in the building and handle the guards, but the safe was hardened steel that couldn't be blown without alerting the whole block. Bumpy looked at the map and then at the men who were about to risk their lives for a boxer they barely knew. "We don't have the combination," he admitted, noting that nobody outside Gigante's inner circle did. A murmur of unease went through the room, for going into a mob stronghold without a way to open the vault was a death wish. "But one of the men inside that house knows it," Bumpy said, his eyes hard as flint. "We just have to find out which one and persuade him to share." He acknowledged the risk, knowing that if Gigante found out he would come for all of them, but he reminded them that a young man was about to stand in Madison Square Garden and fight for his life. "The least we can do," Bumpy said, placing his hand on the map right over Pleasant Avenue, "is clear the path for him. Get some rest, gentlemen. Tonight, we plan. Tomorrow, we make history." March 13th, 1963. Madison Square Garden was a pressure cooker, packed with 18,732 people in the first sellout the arena had seen in 13 years. The air was thick with cigar smoke, cheap beer, and the electric hum of violence. In the center of the ring, under the blinding hot lights, Cassius Clay was dancing, flicking his left jab and moving on his toes like the arrogant showman the crowd loved to hate. But inside, his mind was racing. Every flashbulb popping in the darkness looked like a camera that might have taken a picture of the tape, and every cheer for his opponent sounded like the mob laughing at him. Across the ring, Doug Jones, a journeyman the experts said had no chance, was fighting like a man with nothing to lose. When the bell rang for round 1, Clay came out fast but tight, his rhythm off as he looked for a desperate knockout to end the nightmare early. But Jones didn't fall. Instead, he ducked, weaved, and fired a right hand straight down the pipe that caught Clay flush on the jaw. The crowd exploded. The Golden Boy was human. At 8:15 p.m., 3 blocks away from the target brownstone in East Harlem, 2 black Cadillacs sat idling in the dark with no lights and no radio, just the low rumble of engines and the sound of rain beginning to slick the streets. Inside the lead car, Illinois Gordon checked his watch and whispered that the fight was in round 2, meaning the guards would be distracted. Shadows detached themselves from the car as 6 men dressed in black moved down the alleyway behind Pleasant Avenue with the silent precision of ghosts. They were walking into the lion's den, knowing that if they were caught here, There would be no trial and no police report. They would simply vanish. Back at the garden, it was 8:30 p.m., round 4, and the fight was turning into a nightmare. Doug Jones wasn't just surviving, he was winning, cutting off the ring and landing body shots that made Clay's ribs ache, while his legs, usually so light, felt heavy. A left hook caught Clay on the temple, blurring his vision and tilting the world. For one terrifying second, Cassius Clay thought he was going down, the promise of Tony Pictures echoing in his head to lose the fight or lose everything. It would have been so easy to just bend the knee, take the deal, and live to fight another day. But then he remembered the handshake and the old man in the office above Small's Paradise, who promised to burn the tape himself. Clay bit down on his mouthpiece, grabbed Jones, and held on for dear life while his head cleared, telling himself, "Not tonight." While Clay held on in the ring, Illinois Gordon made his move in the alley at 8:31 p.m. The back door of the safe house was old wood swollen from the damp, but Marcus Webb knelt before the lock, his hands steady as he worked the pick until it clicked. He pushed the door open to an empty kitchen smelling of stale coffee and marinara sauce, but from the front room came the blue glow of a television and the sound of the fight announcer screaming that Clay was in trouble. Inside that front room, 4 mob soldiers were glued to the screen, cheering for Jones, completely unaware that death had just walked into their kitchen. Marcus signaled with 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, and the team breached the room. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a takedown, fast, brutal, and silent. Dwayne Harris moved left and Jerome Patterson moved right, using blackjacks and sleeper holds to drop 4 men in 30 seconds before they could even reach for their weapons. The only sound left was the television. Marcus keyed his radio to report the first floor was clear and Bumpy Johnson entered the house. He didn't look at the unconscious men on the floor. He looked up the stairs to the second level, where a safe and a man with a gun were guarding the only thing that mattered. "Teddy," Bumpy said calmly, "with me, we have a safe to crack." 8:35 p.m. The second floor. The hallway was narrow, smelling of old carpet and gun oil, as Bumpy Johnson moved toward the door at the end of the hall with his heart steady and his hand on the grip of his pistol. Behind him, Teddy Jr. held a sawed-off shotgun with sweat beading on his forehead. They were 3 feet from the door when the handle turned, and a young, panicked guard burst out firing blindly. The bullet tore into the plaster inches from Bumpy's head, showering him with white dust. But while Bumpy dove left, Teddy didn't flinch. The shotgun roared, sending the guard spinning backward to hit the floor hard, his pistol sliding across the linoleum. He wasn't dead, but the fight had left him, and as he lay there clutching his shoulder, Bumpy saw the target in the corner of the room, a heavy steel safe meant to hold money, secrets, and souls. Bumpy holstered his gun and knelt beside the wounded guard, asking with icy calm if the man knew who he was. The guard nodded, eyes wide with recognition, whispering Bumpy's name. "That's right," Bumpy said. "Now, listen to me very carefully. I am going to ask you for the combination to that safe. I am going to ask you exactly 1 time." When the guard stammered that Gigante would kill him, Bumpy simply pressed a knife against the man's cheek and reminded him that Gigante was tomorrow's problem. "I spent 11 years in a box learning exactly how much pain a human being can endure," Bumpy said. "Do you want to find out what I learned?" 5 seconds passed in a silence louder than the gunshots, until the guard looked at the knife, looked at Bumpy's eyes, and realized the stories were true. He broke, whispering the numbers, 15, 28, 41. Bumpy stood up instantly, spun the dial, and swung the heavy door open. Inside were stacks of cash, which he ignored, reaching instead into the back for the 3 reel-to-reel tapes. He checked the labels, Councilman Martinez, Judge Harrison, and the one that mattered, Clay Malcolm X, and grabbed them all, sweeping the cash into the bag as reparations before saying, Let's move. 8:47 p.m. The escape. They were halfway down the stairs when the front door burst open again, not with police but with the cavalry, 2 men in expensive suits from the local social club who had heard the commotion. They saw the bodies on the floor and Bumpy Johnson on the stairs, and the room erupted into chaos. Bullets chewed up the banister as Marcus Webb popped up from behind a sofa to return fire, dropping one of the Italians while the other scrambled for cover. "Go! Out the back! Now!" Marcus shouted, and the team ran, bursting through the kitchen with boots sliding on the linoleum before exploding into the alleyway where the engine of the getaway car was already roaring. Willie Thompson had the passenger door open before the car even stopped moving, screaming for them to get in. They piled into the Cadillac, and as Willie stomped on the gas, the back window shattered from a final shot that grazed Calvin Moore in the back seat. The car fishtailed onto the wet street, tires screaming as they disappeared into the labyrinth of Harlem, leaving the brownstone in chaos and sirens wailing in the distance. Illinois Gordon turned in the front seat to look at Bumpy, who was breathing hard and adjusting his tie. Bumpy reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the plastic case, and said simply, "I got it." In the back of a speeding Cadillac, surrounded by men with guns, Bumpy Johnson held the future of the heavyweight champion of the world in the palm of his hand. 9:15 p.m., an abandoned warehouse in West Harlem. The Cadillac screeched to a halt inside the cavernous space, the engine dying into a ticking silence as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the dull ache of bruises. Bumpy Johnson stepped out, walking to an oil drum in the center of the concrete floor, while Marcus, Illinois, and Teddy gathered around him silently. Illinois Gordon broke the silence, asking about the other 2 tapes, Martinez and the judge, suggesting they could use that leverage for the future. But Bumpy looked at the reels and refused, stating with quiet conviction, "We aren't blackmailers. Not tonight. Tonight we are cleaners." He tossed the first 2 tapes into the drum, then held the third one, the voice of a young man trying to find his God in a country that wanted him on his knees. Bumpy struck a match, watching the orange and blue flame dance before saying, "For Cassius, for Malcolm, for every one of us who ever had to hide in the shadows." He dropped the match, and the old film caught instantly, the plastic curling and hissing as the secrets of Cassius Clay twisted into smoke and drifted up toward the rafters. Bumpy watched it burn until nothing remained but ash, checked his watch at 9:30 p.m., and said, "It's done. Now, let's see if the kid did his part." Back at Madison Square Garden, it was round 10, the final round. Cassius Clay was tired, his eye swollen shut and lungs burning, but something had changed in the air. He didn't know about the fire, yet he felt lighter. Doug Jones came out desperate, swinging wild for the knockout Tony Pictures had promised would happen if Clay refused to dive. But Clay wasn't diving. He was flying. His hands became a blur, dancing on toes. It should have been exhausted, fighting not for a paycheck, but for his name. When Jones threw a haymaker, Clay slipped under it smooth as silk and came up with a combination that shook the sweat off Jones's head, bringing the crowd to its feet in a roar of confusion and awe. The final bell rang continuously, signaling the end. Clay didn't wait for the decision. He jumped onto the ropes, screaming at the press, the mobsters, and the world. "I am the greatest. I told you, I am the greatest." And miles away, in the silence of a warehouse, an old gangster watched the smoke clear and whispered one word, "Amen." March 14th, 1963. 3:04 a.m., Little Italy. Vincent the Chin Gigante sat in the darkness of his social club, staring at a report that made his blood run cold. A safe house raided, 6 men hospitalized, 3 tapes destroyed, and $47,000 missing. Tony Pictures stood in the doorway waiting for the order to go to war, to burn Harlem to the ground, but Gigante didn't move. He stared at the empty space on the desk where the leverage used to be and simply said, "No." When Tony protested that Bumpy had hit a maid guy and stolen from the family, Gigante snapped back with the cold logic of a boss, realizing that Bumpy hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen FBI wiretaps. If they went to war tomorrow, the whole city would ask why the mob possessed federal evidence, and the 5 families would discover Gigante's side hustle with blackmail. He walked to the window, looking out at the city he thought he owned, and admitted defeat. "He trapped us," Gigante said, his face a mask of rage. "He checkmated us. We swallow it. Today we pretend none of this happened, but someday there will be a reckoning." At 2 a.m. in Harlem, the office above Small's Paradise was quiet, the war over before the newspapers even knew it had begun. Cassius Clay sat across from Bumpy Johnson in the same chairs with the same smoke, but in a different world. "It's done," Bumpy told him. "Gigante won't move. He can't." Clay shook his head, looking at the hands that had just won a war in the ring, and asked the question that still haunted him: why a man he didn't know would risk his life and his people for a boxer. Bumpy poured 2 glasses of cognac and slid one across the desk, explaining that he didn't do it for a boxer. "I did it because when I was your age, I came to this city with nothing but a blade and a bad attitude," Bumpy said. "I fought for every inch, but I always had to fight alone. I watched a lot of good men get crushed because they didn't have protection." He leaned back, the shadow of the years crossing his face, and told the young champion that while he had done things that would send him to hell, tonight he had helped make sure the next generation had a chance to fly. He pointed a finger at Clay and said, "You're going to be the heavyweight champion of the world. And when you are, remember, you got there standing on your own 2 feet. You didn't kneel." Clay took the glass, looked Bumpy in the eye, and promised he would never forget. He kept that promise. 11 months later, on February 25, 1964, in Miami Beach, Cassius Clay stepped into the ring against Sonny Liston, the monster the mob couldn't control. With odds 7-1 against him, he danced, stung, and made the monster look old. When Liston quit on his stool, Clay stood in the center of the ring and screamed the words that Bumpy Johnson had helped him save. "I shook up the world." The next morning, the boy was gone. He announced his conversion to Islam and took the name Muhammad Ali. The tape that would have destroyed him was ash in a Harlem oil drum, and he was free to be the greatest. 5 years later, on July 7, 1968, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat down for breakfast at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street, ordered chicken and waffles, smiled at a friend, and his heart simply stopped. He died as he lived in Harlem, unbowed and unbroken. Muhammad Ali couldn't attend the funeral as he was fighting his own war against the U.S. government, stripped of his title for refusing the draft. But years later, he spoke of a man in Harlem who taught him what courage really meant. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes history is saved by the outlaws, by the men who operate in the dark so others can shine in the light. This was the story of the night the mob blinked, the night a gangster saved a legend. If this story moved you, if the code of Bumpy Johnson means something to you, then hit that subscribe button. We are telling the stories the history books tried to bury, the stories of men who refused to ask for permission to be great. Drop a comment below and tell us what you would have done in Clay's position. This is the channel for the dangerous and the free. Stay dangerous, stay free, and never, ever kneel.